Over the past several months, I've been watching the growth of anti-immigrant mobilization in South Africa with a very deep sense of unease. Not because migration shouldn't be debated. It should. Every country has the right to debate immigration policy. Every country has the right to regulate its borders. Every country has the right to decide who may enter, who may remain, and under what conditions. Those are legitimate political questions. But what concerns me is something else entirely. What concerns me is what happens when people begin to lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to manage those questions. Because when that happens, something dangerous begins to emerge. People stop demanding that the state act. Instead, they begin acting as though they are the state. And I think that's exactly what we're beginning to see in South Africa today. If you've been following recent events, you've probably seen the footage. Groups moving through communities, people being asked for papers as though a vigilante shadow version of ICE in the US has now been mobilized in South Africa, but parallel to the state instead of from it. These groups perform the same function as ICE does in the US, fomenting fear, bringing chaos and disruption into the lives of immigrants. Businesses are being targeted, crowds are gathering, threats are being issued, ultimatums are being delivered, and all of it justified in the name of solving South Africa's immigration problem. Now, before I go any further, let me say something that is obvious. South Africans are suffering. We are living through an unemployment crisis, a cost of living crisis, a crisis of governance, a crisis of public trust. Millions of people are struggling to survive. And it would be foolish to dismiss those frustrations. The question is not whether those frustrations are real, however. The question is whether immigration is actually responsible for them. Because when you look beyond the slogans and the social media posts and the inflammatory speeches, a very different picture begins to emerge. A growing body of evidence on migration in South Africa suggests that many of the assumptions that dominate public debate are either exaggerated, weakly supported, or simply contradicted by the available evidence. But interestingly, that's not actually what concerns me the most. Because even if every claim made by anti-immigrant activists were true, the constitutional question would remain exactly the same. Who gets to enforce the law? Who gets to decide who belongs? Who gets to determine whose rights matter? And under our constitution, the answer is straightforward. Not the mob, but the state, through a system of lawful procedures, through due process, through institutions that are accountable to the Constitution. That distinction matters because what we are increasingly witnessing is not simply opposition to immigration. We are witnessing the emergence of groups that have begun to assume powers that belong exclusively to the state. They conduct raids. They demand documentation. They identify targets. They issue threats. They decide for themselves who should be subjected to scrutiny and who should not. In doing so, they are not enforcing the law. They are replacing it. And history suggests that this is where things become dangerous. One of the foundational principles of constitutional democracy is that the law applies equally to everyone. Not just citizens, not just people we agree with, not just people we disagree with either, everyone. The Constitution does not cease to operate because people are angry. It does not become optional when confronted with an immigration problem. And it does not disappear because a crowd has decided that certain people deserve fewer protections than others. In fact, constitutional principles matter most when public passions run high. because that is precisely when societies become tempted to abandon them. And once that process begins, it rarely stops where it starts. This is a lesson that history teaches us again and again. What happens when ordinary citizens start doing the state's job? In Nazi Germany, during the early years of the Third Reich, organizations such as the SA, the Stormtroopers or Brown Shirts, began exercising forms of authority that increasingly bypassed ordinary legal procedures. In Rwanda, before the genocide, militias and local power structures gradually became instruments through which violence was normalized and directed at a targeted population. The result was the death of 1 million people in 100 days. In the former Yugoslavia, nationalist mobilization increasingly blurred the distinction between political authority and ethnic vigilantism. In the United States today, we have seen armed civilian groups patrolling border regions, claiming powers that belong to the state. And in the occupied West Bank, there are countless documented cases in which settlers have been intimidated, harassed, attacked, and displaced, and Palestinians from their homes and land. Authorities have often failed to intervene consistently or effectively condoning their actions. These situations are not identical, but they share a common feature. The state ceases to act as an impartial guarantor of rights. Political movements often emerge around real grievances, but the danger begins when those grievances become organized around enemies rather than solutions. The reality is that people are suffering, people are frustrated, people feel ignored, but over time, those grievances become attached to something else, a politics of exclusion, a politics of enemies, a politics in which constitutional constraints are increasingly portrayed as obstacles rather than safeguards. And eventually, the issue ceases to be immigration. It becomes power, the power to decide who belongs, the power to decide who deserves protection, the power to decide whose rights matter. South Africans should recognize this pattern because we've seen versions of it before. The era of state capture was not simply about corruption. It was about weakening the institutions that constrained power. Its architects understood something very important. If you want to enrich yourself, if you want to evade accountability, if you want to exercise power without consequences, then the Constitution becomes a problem. Independent courts become a problem. Accountable institutions become a problem. The rule of law becomes a problem. And so those constraints must be weakened. Today, we are seeing a different set of actors pursuing different objectives, but the effect is the same. Whenever constitutional protections become conditional, whenever some groups are permitted to act outside the law, whenever the state becomes selective in whose rights it protects, constitutional democracy itself begins to erode. And there's another question that I rarely hear anti-immigrant activists answer. What happens when all the foreigners are gone? History provides a fairly predictable answer. The target changes. Movements built on exclusion always require new outsiders, new enemies, new threats, because their legitimacy comes not from law, but from anger. And once that logic becomes established, nobody is truly safe. South Africa has already experienced what happens when constitutional authority is weakened. In July 2021, we witnessed one of the most serious crises of the democratic era. What began as a political dispute rapidly escalated into widespread unrest. Businesses were destroyed, communities were traumatized, lives were lost, and the economic consequences are still being felt today. That episode should serve as a warning, because the danger is not simply what is happening now. The danger is what becomes normal. A democracy cannot survive if constitutional rights depend on nationality. It cannot survive if private groups acquire the practical authority to determine who belongs and who does not. And it cannot survive if citizens believe that the law is something to be enforced by crowds rather than institutions. Which brings me back to the title of this video, the immigration Trojan horse. Because I do not believe immigration is the real issue. Immigration is the justification through which constitutional limits are increasingly being challenged. It is the vehicle through which a deeper struggle is unfolding, a struggle over whether constitutional government remains stronger than the mob. And that is why this moment matters. The choice confronting South Africa is no longer simply about immigration policy. It is about whether we still believe that the Constitution is the highest authority in this land. Because once that belief begins to disappear, recovering it is neither quick nor easy. And history suggests something else as well. Mobilizing mobs to replace the law very rarely yields justice. Thank you. Click on the like or subscribe button if you want more people to get this on their feeds.